Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Memnarch. Memnarch is a 4/5 artifact creature wizard that costs 7. It has pay 1 blue, target permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types, and pay 3 and a blue, gain control of target artifact. So Memnarch is a very straightforward commander to build around. We want to use both of his abilities to gain control of permanents. So our strategy for this deck is really simple. We want to ramp as quickly as possible to steal our opponent's permanents. Not only is this deck running a ton of mana rocks, but we can also steal our opponent's mana rocks pretty easily too. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to use our opponent's own threats against them. Since we can turn anything into an artifact, none of our opponent's permanents are safe. And if our opponents refuse to play any threats, we can just steal all their permanents instead to wipe them out. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's start off with tactic number 1, Metal Mana. First up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land to put into play tapped. And then we're going to be running Fractured Power Stone and Guardian Idol, both of which tap for a colorless. Guardian Idol does enter the battlefield tapped, but we can pay 2 to make it into a 2/2 artifact creature. Next up is Prismatic Lens, which can either tap for a colorless or can filter our mana. And then Star Compass is going to enter the battlefield tapped, but it can tap for a blue as long as we control an island. Next up, we've got 3 mana rocks that tap for 2 colorless with Worn Power Stone, Sisay's Ring, and Urgolem's Eye. Worn Power Stone does cost 1 less than the other 2, but it does enter the battlefield tapped. And then we're going to be running 3 cards that do the exact same thing but in different amounts. Mind Stone taps for a colorless, and we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw 1 card. Hedron Archive does the exact same thing, but it taps for 2, and we have to pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And same with Dreamstone Hedron, but everything's for 3. And finally, we're running 2 mana rocks that produce a different amount of mana depending on how much we put into them. Everflowing Chalice is going to tap for colorless mana for half the amount of mana that we put into it. And Astral Cornucopia is going to tap for 1 color of mana for 1/3 of the amount of mana that we put into it. In this deck especially, both of these can tap for a ton of mana. But mana rocks aren't going to be our only sources of ramp. So let's go through some more ways for us to ramp in tactic number 2, Metal Crafters. First up, we're going to be running Milliken and Deranged Assistant, both of which do the exact same thing. We can tap them for a colorless, but we have to put the top card of our library into our graveyard. And then we're going to be running Hedron Crawler, Mannequin, and Sea Scryer, each of which tap for a colorless. Next up is Silvermere, which is going to tap for a blue. Since Memnarch's abilities do require some blue, we do prefer to have blue sources when we can. But efficiently costed colorless sources are great too. So that's why we're running Chief Engineer, which has artifact spells you cast have Convoke. Now while Chief Engineer can't tap to activate any of Memnarch's abilities, it still provides a ton of value. It allows all of our creatures to tap to help cast artifacts right away. Depending on our setup, this can lead to some pretty explosive turns. Next up, we've got some more creatures that can really help us ramp with Soldevi Machinist, Vidalcan Engineer, and Renowned Weaponsmith. Soldevi Machinist can tap to add 2 colorless to our mana pool, but we can only use that mana to activate abilities of artifacts. So while this doesn't help us cast anything else, it can really help us with Memnarch's abilities. Vidalcan Engineer and Renowned Weaponsmith are both improved versions of this because they allow us to use that mana to cast artifact spells. And on top of that, Vidalcan Engineer can even tap for blue mana. And finally, we're going to be running Palladium Mirror and Apprentice Wizard, both of which essentially tap for 2 colorless. The amount of ramp in this deck is absurd, but we're not done just quite yet. So let's move on to tactic number 3, Mass Mana. First up, we're going to be running Dramatic Reversal, which is going to allow us to untap all non-land permanents we control. Essentially, this allows us to tap all of our mana rocks and mana dorks twice in the same turn. This allows us to produce an incredible amount of mana that we can either use to cast even more spells or to activate Memnarch's abilities a ton of times. So we're also going to be running Intellectual Offering, which does the exact same thing but in a different way. It says choose an opponent, you and that player each draw 3 cards. And choose an opponent, untap all non-land permanents you control and all non-land permanents that player controls. So while this does cost us a little more and helps out one of our opponents, it is going to draw some cards and still be very effective in this deck. Next up, we're going to be running Thran Turbine, which says at the beginning of your upkeep you may add 2 colorless to your mana pool, but you can't spend this mana to cast spells. What we can use that mana for though is to help activate Memnarch's abilities. And then we're going to be running Clock of Omens, which says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. This card essentially makes it so that every single one of our artifacts can tap for mana. Because if we control one artifact that can tap for mana, we can tap other artifacts to untap it. This card is especially good when we have something like a Dreamstone Hedron in play. And it's also very effective in combination with Blinkmoth Urn. Blinkmoth Urn says at the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, if Blinkmoth Urn is untapped, that player adds colorless for each artifact they control. We are running a ton of mana rocks in this deck, so this can easily generate a lot of mana for us. And if we have Clock of Omens in play, we can even deny our opponents this effect. We've already gone through 3 tactics about ramping, but we've got one more. So let's go through it now with tactic number 4, Closeout Sale. First up, there's Ethereum Sculptor and Foundry Inspector, both of which say artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Getting either of these down early can really speed up our game plan. And then there's Joyous Familiar, which does pretty much the exact same thing for this deck. It says historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. With the number of artifacts that we're running in this deck, we're going to take as many of these effects as we can get. Alright, so we're done talking about ramping, so what's next? Let's talk about some ways to protect our commander in tactic number 5, Safety Helmet. First up, there's Mask of Avacyn, which is going to give our commander +1/+2 and hexproof. The +1/+2 is nice, but we really just have this in here for the hexproof. Next up, we've got Nurok Stealth Suit, Cloak and Dagger, and Whisper Silk Cloak, each of which is going to give our commander Shroud. And finally, there's Padim Council of Innovation, which serves a dual purpose for this deck. It has artifacts you control have hexproof, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control the artifact with the highest converted mana cost or tied for the highest converted mana cost, draw a card. So not only does this protect all of our artifacts, but it's also going to draw us a ton of cards throughout the game. Our commander is an artifact that costs 7, so the vast majority of the time, we're going to be drawing that card. So now that we've ramped and protected our commander, what's next? Let's find some ways to help him out in tactic number 6, Making Metal. First up, there's Nurok Transmitter, which allows us to pay a blue to make target creature an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. So as long as we have this in play, we can just make creatures into artifacts by just paying 1 instead of 3. And the only condition is that we have to gain control of it before the end of the turn. Thrain Forge is very similar. It has pay 2 until the end of the turn, target non-artifact creature gets +1/+0 and becomes an artifact in addition to its other types. So this effect is still going to cost us 1 less than Memnarch's ability. Next up is Liquid Metal Coating, which has tap target permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. This is a fantastic effect that essentially saves us 3 mana each time it's activated. Now, although this card is great in this deck, it's still nowhere near as powerful as our Golden Pig. The Golden Pig of the deck is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Heartstone. Heartstone is an artifact that costs 3, and it says activated abilities of creatures cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana an ability costs to activate to less than 1 mana. So essentially with this in play, Memnarch's abilities read pay blue, target permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types. And pay 2 and a blue, gain control of target artifact. On its own, Memnarch's abilities cost 7 mana total to gain control of any permanent. But with Heartstone in play, it essentially reduces that cost to 5. This deck is able to ramp at an incredible rate, and Heartstone makes it so that we can more efficiently use that mana. Instead of gaining control of only 1 permanent in a turn, we can easily gain control of 2 or more. If our opponents don't deal with Heartstone, the game is going to end pretty quickly. And that's what makes Heartstone the Golden Pig of the deck. But how do we make sure that we get to some of our great cards like Heartstone? Let's see some spells that can help us out in tactic number 7, Drawing Schematics. First up, we're going to be running Thoughtcast, which has affinity for artifacts, so essentially we're just going to draw 2 cards for 1 mana. And next up, there's Fact or Fiction, which is going to let us reveal the top 5 cards of our library, and an opponent's going to separate those cards into 2 piles, and we get to pick the better pile. Next up, we're going to be running 2 cards that can draw us a ton of cards at once. One with the machine is going to draw us cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among artifacts we control. And Rush of Knowledge does the exact same thing, except it's permanents instead of artifacts. Regardless, if we cast either of these with our commander on the battlefield, we're going to be drawing 7 cards. And then we've got 2 X spells at instant speed that can really take advantage of all of our mana. Read the Runes is going to draw us X cards, but for each card drawn this way, we have to discard a card unless we sacrifice a permanent. And Epiphany at the Drownyard is just basically a bigger Fact or Fiction. And finally, we're going to be running Lore Seeker's Stone. It says pay 3 and tap it to draw 3 cards, but this ability is going to cost 1 more to activate for each card in our hand. Since this deck is very good at casting things quickly, usually we don't have too much additional cost. But these aren't our only ways to help us dig for our best cards. Let's go through some more in tactic number 8, A Little Help. First up, there's Artificer's Assistant, which has whenever you cast a historic spell, scry 1. And then Riddlesmith says whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. While neither of these technically help us with card advantage, they do help us filter through any dead cards. And then we're going to be running Trinket Mage, which when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for an artifact card with converted mana cost of 1 or less and put it into our hand. This can help us go get something like Everflowing Chalice, Thran Turbine, or even a card we haven't talked about yet. And then Trophy Mage does the exact same thing, but for a converted mana cost of 3. 9 times out of 10, we're going to use this to go get Heartstone since it's such an impactful card. So now that we've talked a lot about our game plan, what about disrupting our opponents? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 9, Not This Time. First up, there's Negate and Unwind, both of which are going to counter-target non-creature spell. Unwind also has the nice additional effect of untapping up to 3 of our lands. And then there's Rewind, which is going to counter-target spell and untap up to 4 of our lands. Untapping those lands can be very important for this deck, because if we have our commander in play, we can use that mana for one of its abilities. Now, our commander is great at taking control of our opponent's permanents, but what if we need some other ways to impact our opponent's board? Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 10, In the Zone. First up, there's Glaring Spotlight, which is essentially going to take away hexproof from our opponent's creatures. We can also pay 3 and sacrifice it to give all of our creatures hexproof and unblockable until end of turn. This card can come in huge in this deck and is one of our targets for Trinket Mage. It allows us to use our commander to take control of creatures that have hexproof, which we otherwise wouldn't be able to. Next up, we've got Aetherize, which is going to return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. This is a fantastic way for us to protect ourselves and to slow an opponent down. Another way to slow our opponents down is Aether Gale, which is going to let us return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. This card is really helpful because it allows us to be selective in what we want returned. And then we're going to be running some combat tricks with Illusionist Gambit and Reigns of Power. Essentially, if one of our opponents attacks us and we cast Illusionist Gambit, they have to turn all those creatures around and swing at someone else. And then Reigns of Power allows us to temporarily exchange all of our creatures for someone else's. So if someone's swinging big at us, we can just take someone else's army and block with them. And finally, we're going to be running Blatant Thievery, which says for each opponent, gain control of target permanent that player controls. This is essentially a more cost-effective version of Memnarch's ability. It's a very powerful card and can even win games on its own. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, there's Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, which can tap for a colorless, or can tap for 2 colorless if we spend that mana only to cast colorless spells, and we can only activate that ability if we control 7 or more lands. And then there's Detection Tower, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 and tap it, and until end of turn, your opponents and creatures your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities you control as though they didn't have hexproof. And finally, the rest of our mana base is pretty simple. We're just going to be running 35 islands. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Memnarch EDH rec deck is going to set you back $435.59, let's see if we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.96. And just a quick reminder that our deck cost actually doesn't include our commander because it is a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades that you can add into the deck and what I would take out for those cards too. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into this, these reasonable upgrades are going to be completely based off of my own perspective. When you're making choices on how to adjust your deck, you're taking your own playstyle and meta into account. So make sure that you factor that in when it comes to making your own decisions on what to swap in and what to swap out. Now that we're on the same page, let's go through how I personally would upgrade the deck. First up, let's add in Lightning Greaves, which comes in at $6.77. It's an equipment that costs 2 and it costs 0 to equip, and it says equip creature has haste and shroud. To put Lightning Greaves in, we're going to be taking out Cloak and Dagger. This is a very easy swap for us. Lightning Greaves is pretty much superior in every single way. Its free equip cost can be invaluable. And while this deck can produce a ton of mana, we don't want to waste that mana on equipping things if we don't have to. Next up, let's add in Soul Ring, which comes in at $4.01. It's an artifact that costs 1 and it taps for 2 colorless. To put Soul Ring in, we're going to be taking out Deranged Assistant. This one is a no-brainer. Soul Ring taps for more and it has no downside. There are times when Deranged Assistant can actually mill one of our best cards off the top of our library and we can't get it back. So next up we're going to add in Gilded Lotus, which comes in at $2.40. It's an artifact that costs 5 and it's going to tap for 3 mana of any one color. To put Gilded Lotus in, we're going to take out Milliken. Gilded Lotus is a fantastic addition to this deck and it can tap for a ton of mana. Whereas again, Milliken can actually hurt us if it mills the wrong card off the top. And then let's upgrade this deck with Illusionist Bracers, which comes in at $4.39. It's an equipment that costs 2 and it costs 3 to equip. It says whenever an ability of equipped creature is activated, if it isn't a mana ability, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. To put Illusionist Bracers in, we're going to take out Soldevi Machinist. Illusionist Bracers is a powerhouse in this deck, doubling up our Memnarch activations. And Soldevi Machinist can just be too situational since it doesn't actually ramp us, it only helps us use Memnarch's ability. Next up, let's add in Unwinding Clock, which comes in at $2.32. It's an artifact that costs 4 and it says untap all artifacts you control during each other player's untap step. To put this in, we're going to take out Thran Turbine. Unwinding Clock allows us to produce an incredible amount of mana during our opponent's turns. With this mana, we can activate Memnarch's abilities over and over again. Thran Turbine can be very restrictive since it forces us to use mana during our upkeep. Unwinding Clock is an incredible addition to the deck and an easy swap for us. Finally, we're going to be adding in Mycosynth Lattice, which comes in at $8.45. It's an artifact that costs 6 and it says all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. All cards that aren't on the battlefield, spells and permanents are colorless, and players may spend mana as though it were any color. To put this card in, we're going to be taking out Thran Forge. Essentially, Lattice makes it so that we never have to use Memnarch's first ability. Since everything's going to be an artifact, we can gain control of anything. Thran Forge is a good card, but it only reduces our cost by 1 and only for creatures. So that additional 3 mana to cast Lattice is well worth it. If you're looking to play a mono blue deck in a different kind of format, why don't you go check out the Arena Sanctuary? Dan from the Arena Sanctuary is a brand new content creator and he is doing some fantastic work. His very first episode was featured on the Creators Quarters initiative, so go like and subscribe to his channel. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.